and the Madrid WDC ACHCOR. So we will have Nolo and Rob as the government side and Jess and Shuradip as the opposition. I think we are streamed. Can someone just check on Facebook so I'm not talking to you again? Good. Okay, cool. So the topic will be the topic from round 2 yesterday, and we will do the top half debate. Judges, if you wanna like track the debate later, me and Shudipto, we will be judging together, will give some sort of quick overview, some sort of information about the tracking. Or can you please mute yourself on the Zoom, please? And yeah, speeches are 7 minutes. POIs are encouraged. If you will not take POIs, then I will be reminding you about reading Judge Manual, which you wrote. So have fun. And Shudipta, if you can keep time, please, that would be great. And without further ado, Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
G'day, can everyone still hear me?
Yes, all good.
Great, thank you. All right, let's get the show on the road. The power to deplatform someone is an immense power. Given the role that social media has in how it enables politicians to communicate with people, how it is the primary source of connection for the majority of particularly young people to their news and to their politics. If you take someone off there, you are functionally removing that power from them to ever be elected or to ever sell their message. But additionally, the power of the platform also grants that person speaking an immense amount of power too, a power to spread hate, a power to spread violence, a power to incite an insurgency on Capitol Hill. Those are things that must be taken seriously. And the question you have to ask yourself today is, do you want a panel of independent, experienced, knowledgeable people making that call outside of business interests, or do you want Mark Zuckerberg making those decisions? And I think it's pretty clear that we don't want Mark Zuckerberg, no matter how cool his Independence Day video was. You should look it up if you haven't seen it. In terms of the modeling of how we're going to do this then, this will be set up as an international body. It will be an independent body. And by that, we mean that like no one actively on the boards or companies or the social media companies will be on that board. I think we set up similar in the way to which like international anti-doping bodies like WADA, the World Anti-Doping Association, are set up and have support and funding from the member country, like the member sporting associations, which in this case would be like the member social media companies or governments. And what would they do? They would hear applications from social media companies to deplatform people, and it would kind of function like a tribunal or a court. Probably not as serious or as formal as a court, but that kind of process whereby both sides would present their reasoning as to why it ought be deplatformed or not be deplatformed. They would then make decisions. Those decisions would be binding, and those decisions would like build up over time as a series of precedent and so forth. Who is on this international committee? This looks like a broad set of international people. It's probably people from the tech industry, former like senior employees of companies, probably a whole bunch of lawyers as well. People have senior experience and relevant to the sort of things these boards will be dealing with. And they would likely, once the initial group is appointed, it would be a body that would appoint its own subsequent members. It's not like governments would send in their own reps to have their own view. How would they make decisions? I think the way to think about this is that all your big social media corporations have broadly similar terms and conditions about things like banning hate speech, about things like not being able to incite violence and all that sort of stuff. So what they're likely going to be doing is having like broad sets of rules like that that have pretty common and pretty standard principles that apply across all those companies. And they'll be making judgments based off the companies saying they have clearly breached these elements of our terms and conditions. Therefore, we would like them to be deplatformed because they have breached those conditions in that sort of in that way. Obviously, there might be a concern for the position bench around like, what if a government is involved, or what if it's deeply conservative or deeply harmful, like Poland or Hungary or things like that. I think the unfortunate reality is that in a lot of cases, maybe neither side can fix those politicians who are acting in a way where it is like accepted or normalized, or they can just get away with it in their own country, whether that be good or whether that be bad, because it's unlikely those applications would ever be brought to deplatform that person. But I think also I'd say that the terms and conditions are pretty clear, and a lot of the worst examples you'd be talking about in those countries around like anti-gay laws and things like that would clearly be a breach of the terms and conditions anyway around hate speech, so they would be blocked if ever they came up. So I'll take any points of clarification now. Suridip? Jess? No? or point information. Why not? Let's go for it.
Surely this only... you go, Sarah, you go.
Somebody.
If social media companies are able to set terms and conditions, how is it practically any different from them being able to exercise that power and remove individuals from that platform?
Oh, it's massively different. That would be my speech, because the problem is they don't exercise that power. It's not as if they couldn't have silenced Trump a lot earlier. They just chose not to because of a lot of bad incentives. So the first thing I want to get to before that actually is around why this is a legitimate thing to do. Even though it's a private company, the fact they act as functionally a public good in communicating information to the people in a way that is essential for functioning democracies to operate basically now, we think it's legitimate to override any sort of like personal corporate interests and set down an international body to interfere in their corporate rights. But also obviously in the setting up of this body, they would be involved in that, so they consent to it. It would be legitimate. So why is social media companies so particularly bad and will not be trusted to deplatform people individually? The first thing to note here is they do have massive corporate incentives because they are a business. Sometimes those are good and sometimes those are bad. But those are influenced by factors I don't think are appropriate in making decisions of whether or not to deplatform people. That is about who necessarily owns that that social media platform and what their own personal political ideologies are. That in terms of like who they donate to or who should offer to support them in Congress and in legislation, and whether or not they want those people deplatformed, whether or not they want their opponents potentially to be deplatformed. It also engages in pressure from people like Rupert Murdoch. They have exceptional media power and pressure to motivate decisions in certain ways or another, or to sway vast parts of the population to boycott a social media network or flood to a social media network, depending on what that network does. All of that means that the decision-making process of a social media company is not necessarily always in the interest of what has been hate speech or what has violated our terms and conditions, but what is going to influence our bottom line. The second thing is that social media companies are often always playing catch up and making rules as they go along, because this is a relatively new industry and deplatforming is a relatively new phenomenon. Thirdly, they also have a lot of inconsistency in their decision making. You know, we banned Trump initially, but we didn't ban someone who from the other side of politics who's made statements about having to burn things down in the past. And I think what those things do is create a negative image of the social media companies for not operating properly. And the fourth thing I think that sort of ties to that as well is that there's a really unclear process when a social media company does it. It happens behind closed doors, it happens very quickly overnight, and no one kind of knows what's going on. The outcome of those things mean that people do engage in backlash to that. And what does backlash actually look like in this context? It looks like people wanting to further push the views that we're trying to ban because they feel like their view has been unjustly silenced under an attack on freedom of speech, which is a huge motivating factor. And that means that social media companies, in order to keep as many people online as they can, are very reluctant to take action until it is too late, until the protesters are already at the door and the first people have already been killed on Capitol Hill. Why is an independent body better than in a minute? You know, not great for time management demonstrations. Sorry, everyone. So firstly, I think the independent body is better because they have a far, far clearer process. And that I think will lead to a lot more buy-in then, because when both sides have an opportunity to express their views, to put their views forward before an independent body that is not influenced or seen to be influenced by corporate interests or by political ideological interests, more people are likely to buy into that decision and less likely to engage in the backlash we talked about. But secondly, companies can just outsource the fuck out of their responsibilities. They can be like, well, it wasn't us. We let it off to someone else to figure out, so don't hate us for that, which I think means companies are more incentivized to move a lot quicker. And that tells into the third thing as well around why this independent body would move a lot quicker than companies is firstly, they can operate on a series of precedents. And once decisions are already made, they can quickly refer back to that precedent, ban someone a lot earlier, and then sort it out later. But secondly, they can also apply for injunctions, so ban them until the full trial happens later. At the end of the day, this independent body doesn't suffer from the same kinds of corporate financial pressures that a social media company does, is likely to act quicker, likely to act better, and likely to get more buy-in, and it is legitimate to do. Therefore, we propose.
Cool. Thank you very much to the Prime Minister. And it's time for Leader of the Opposition to open the case for up.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, a principle. Secondly, what are the comparative incentives of both bodies and why do we think that their side is likely to make worse decisions? And finally, what is the actual outcome on society? Why do we actually likely get worse violence and other radicalization as a result? Firstly, in terms of principle, I just want to note and make an observation that social media companies are the most affected by the sorts of decisions that they make regarding their platforms for a few reasons. The first is just that obviously there's a direct correlation between their image. So if they make certain things that is associated with the brand that they have. Secondly, it is likely to have an impact on their consumers. So if you deplatform a politician and people are following that politician, that is something that directly affects them as a result. But thirdly, often as well, you also have an impact on investors. So if people, for example, decide to pull out capital as a result of your particular decision or not, then that might affect who has confidence in your particular company and who decides to invest as a result. There are probably many more reasons, but those are a pretty compelling set. All of that is to say that they are the most affected by this policy. Let's compare that to the other things that opening government describe. They say that if you're a politician that gets deplatformed, you basically have no other option. You're never going to get re-elected. I just do not think this is true. Politicians have a vast number of different options at their disposal, not only probably other social media outlets, because it's unlikely to be the case that literally every social media outlet bans you, but also just other platforms. You can release media releases. You can go on an interview on the news, right? It is just not the case. And in fact, many politicians weaponize the fact they've been banned to their advantage. So I just do not think this is the abrogation that opening government say. And in terms of information, like, okay, so maybe you're someone that's following Trump and they get banned from Twitter now. Now you can't get the tweets you want. So what? You have other ability to access that information. So the right that's being infringed that opening government described is not that massive, but compared to companies, it is very significant. Let me give you a fun intuition pump, right? Okay, let's talk about Kentucky Fried Chicken. You're going into a, arguably this applies to the same metric that opening government talk about, right? Everyone, has food affects everyone, right? But let's say that, someone is coming into your store and like fucking shit up and just leaving a mess, right? But it affects everyone. So the government says, well, we should be able to have a part of the decision, because if you get kicked out of the store, that's really bad. You don't get to have Kentucky Fried Chicken anymore. Well, KFC is the most affected because it's their store, their staff, their image, their impact as a result. So just because everyone has some kind of amorphous claim to food, that doesn't outweigh the impact that KFC has. I hope you enjoyed that example. So before I continue, Rob, do you have a POI?
The problem with your principle is that all the reasons you say that social media companies are the most affected are exactly the reason they will be very slow, if ever, to act. And that's why they need to offshore the responsibility. And given how big they are, advertisers aren't going to run away from that money source.
No, so that leads me really nicely into the next point, which is why they will make pretty good decisions and why they have good incentives. 5 broad reasons. The first is just a priori. They do have processes to deal with this, right? Opening government just asserts that the other body will have much better processes. Like why? Structurally why? These companies already have proven to have those processes in place. It is not just like these quick overnight decisions as they assert. Secondly, I just think in principle, these companies generally believe in things like freedom of speech. That's why they've created these platforms in the first place. So they probably believe in this as an ideal. Thirdly, they do have other things that necessarily have to tether their various interests. They have shareholders and so on. Fourthly, they obviously care about their consumers. So they're reluctant to just, for example, ban a politician that a huge amount of, their consumers might be following as a result. And fifthly, they have to obviously err on the side of risk in some circumstances, like they don't want to be sued and that sort of thing. All of that, I think, suggests that they're probably likely to make good decisions. Let's weigh that against this, abstract body that opening government create. I'd say the first thing to note is that they're probably largely to be Western. Now, they say that, they're international and they're diversified, but think about how any international body or any international institution tends to form just because of dominance and structures. It tends to often have a very Western skew. Secondly, I just think you're likely to have some degree of a conflict of interest. That is to say, if you have business people represented and that business person happens to have some long tie to a different politician, they're probably likely to make risk-averse decisions as a result, right? And opening government might say, but we'll have processes to deal with this sort of stuff. Often it is very difficult to know exactly when a conflict might arise. And here's an important piece of framing. Given their model is that the company has to bring this to the board, right? It is not as if the board is ever going to make decisions broader than what the company wants. This necessarily has to shrink the amount of decisions that the company wants, right? It is not making decisions that the company doesn't want. It is saying that we will approve you or not, right? So the pool can only necessarily get smaller of ban cases, right? That is important. In that context, there is a very significant risk that this board is risk averse and does not agree with some of the decisions that this social media platform wants to make. And what is that likely to look like? Because I would note in the status quo, hate speech and other types of violent speech often presents itself as not directly saying go out and burn this car, but often is presented in more subtle forms, right? So for example, in India in 2002, riots ensued as a result because Muslims were blamed for setting fire to a train carrying Hindu pilgrims, when in fact that was not the case and it was an accident. and tweets that basically stirred up that conspiracy theory were the thing that led to, riots breaking out as a result, right? It often just looks like politicians invoking ideas of power and nationalism and that sort of thing that does lead to violence. So even if we get 1, 2, 3 decisions that this board does not want to approve, that may significantly lead to that risk of violence. And why is this the most important thing in the debate? 1, just a priori, is a significant harm. It affects people's lives. It affects the impact on them significantly. Secondly, it interferes with many other rights. If you are scared for your safety, you probably cannot do things like freedom of speech. And thirdly, this just has the effect of destabilizing other institutions, like political institutions. See the impact in the aftermath of the riots in the United States and how much that destabilized institutions like Congress. So all of that is very significant. The last thing I want to note is just that actually, I think you get worse radicalization on their side, because there is a perception in the status quo that companies like social media are in bed with big government, and they see that as delegitimizing the decisions that these platforms make. Because opening government's claim is, but they see it as accountable. No, I actually think it's easier for you to justify and accept a decision from a private actor when you perceive it as being in bed with an institution, because a lot of radicals won't make the distinction between an independent body and government. They just won't. So they will confirm their biases that this is the big state acting against them. They'll probably fuel their radicalization and lead to even worse harms around violence. Again, the most important thing in this debate, which opening opposition uniquely lays a claim to. That's why we're proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And it's time for DPM to continue the case for government.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so a few things from opening government in response to the opening opposition case that we've already received. Firstly, let's start with the principle that they bring to us. They tell us, look, we think the most affected body here is the social media outlet, and therefore we need to be able to protect that kind of outcome in a way that is going to ensure that we're still able to give them the kind of benefits that they would ordinarily be able to assume in the instance where they were the ones making these types of decisions. 3 things in response to this. The first one is to say that we insulate these types of social media outlets at the point where we don't give them the capacity to independently make this type of decision, because at the point where you do this, you place them in a position where they have plausible deniability when it comes to the kind of issues that often result from the kind of decision that is made. This is important in 2 ways. Firstly, it removes the power that comes with these politicians being able to say that these particular outlets are utilizing their power to silence them, but it also removes the kind of late happening discussions that say that there is some kind of agenda that is insulated by these types of social media outlets because of the kind of political agendas that they try to push through. This looks like Donald Trump deciding that, look, we think Facebook and Zuckerberg have an issue with me, and therefore they're going to utilize the platform to be able to delegitimize them. And we think that this is important because it delegitimizes the kind of spurred ideas that come from these political individuals in the first place. This is important because the individuals that we're talking about here are often very influential, and therefore the kind of things that they say in public often have a whole lot of following, and that following often affects these social media outlets. This is why you have massive outcry on Twitter with different people feeling as though there has to be a different way of being able to deal with issues that come with individuals like Donald Trump acting in the way that they do. The same thing happens when you see Nigeria's Buhari being removed from Twitter because of having posted something. You see an direct response from them being that we ban individuals from being able to access Twitter in Nigeria because there isn't a clear idea of what the process was to place them in a position of having been banned from that particular social media outlet in the first place. This is important because what it does is that it ultimately responds to the idea that this is some kind of arbitrary discussion or arbitrary response by these social media outlets and gives a clear process as to how it is we deal with that particular issue. Therefore, you insulate them and deal with that issue of the principle that we get from Jess in the first place. The second thing that they tell us then is that, look, we think that they're often going to be risk averse in nature, specifically because of the fact that the way in which they're likely to be characterized is that they're Western in nature and thus aren't likely to want to, create situations where they aren't able to respond to the kind of relationships that they have, right? Two things from us in response to this. Firstly, we think that the ability to set up an independent body is something that ultimately allows us to be able to deal with that kind of problem in the first place, because we think we're more likely to have a situation where the kind of decision-making calculus that is utilized by Twitter when they do this independently, or by Facebook when they do this independently, is one that's going to speak to those exact issues. Things like, what is it that they're likely to gain from being able to ban an individual? What does it mean in terms of the relationships that they currently have, and whether or not those are able to give them the outcomes that they're looking for? And most importantly, why it is that that individual is likely better to be on that platform in the first place. Those types of considerations, and these are the considerations that Robert tells you about quite earlier, are ones that become even more difficult to deal with in the instance where they don't give you the outcome of being able to deplatform these persons in the first place. Because we're both going to be deplatforming in some way or the other, it becomes important how you get that deplatforming and what that means in terms of outcomes. Jess.
What do you think would be worse? A politician being deplatformed when they shouldn't have, losing their job, or a politician being deplatformed when they should have, and then kind of like protecting people against violence and the potential outbreak of that?
There are two things here. Neither of these two things are ones that are specifically going to happen under our model. We think that in our model, we're better off in being able to deal with some of that outcomes in two ways. The first one is to say that you're still going to have that deplatforming happening on both sides. The question is whether or not the decision to deplatform is one that needs to be in the hands of the social media outlets themselves or on a different body. We think that the kind of relationship that they have with the social media platforms at the point where it becomes one that is antagonistic in nature often means that you're going to have the ability to push a number of these like issues and like these ideas that they often have to say that there's this huge agenda against that particular political individual. That's something that's a lot more harmful in nature because it spurs very specific echo chambers within society that often act in response to the kind of things that they believe to be attacks upon the individuals that they find to be of importance. We think having a process that is clear, that is attached to individuals that are outside of what is considered to be the agenda is something that ultimately places them in a position where some of the responses that come from that have to be ones that are going to necessarily speak unto the nature of the body that makes that decision, which is one that is supposed to be independent. Sorry about that, got a call. Supposed to be one that ultimately allows you to be able to access the most judicious nature of that particular setting. And this is something that's of value. But why is this something that's even more important when you take into consideration what often happens when the decision is made overnight and you get the next morning being told, oh, hey, this person has been removed from social media outlets? There are two things that happen here. The first one is that you have a number of people often celebrating the fact that this person has been removed and therefore they no longer have to deal with this issue. But you also have a different demographic that ultimately wants some kind of response as to how it is that this happened, why it is that this happened, and most importantly, are ones that are most likely going to act in revolt against this particular issue. This is something that's of significant importance and is a problem at the point where it's something that looks like having individuals actively bringing out the idea that this is something that is against conservatism, which is mostly usually the kind of issues directly that kind of situation. We think it's important in that instance then to be able to ensure that we do away with the harm that is likely to exist in this, but also we take away from using corporate incentives as the mechanism that we make these types of decisions based on, because of the fact that political individuals particularly have a high level of influence, but secondly, because we think that there's a greater value in being able to moderate the kind of things that they're able to bring into society in the instance where we're able to ensure that the precedent that is set is one that can be tracked, is one that can be utilized to be able to make similar decisions in future, but it's also one that is going to be based on a judicious system that directly seeks to engage them in a way that ultimately allows them the best form of these types of outcomes. Because we protect society and because we ensure that these social media outlets are protected as well, we're better off for this particular debate. Proud to propose.
And thank you very much to DPM, and it's time to sum up the debate as a whole by DLO.
Oh, by the way, am I audible properly?
Yeah.
In the first part of my speech, I'd like to talk about the model, because I think the entire government assumption cannot be that, oh, we're going to have independent, knowledgeable experts about this, and they're somehow magically going to solve all the problems in the government bench. Especially when you look at their examples, like the only example that came about, like with regards to the model itself, was, oh, it's going to be something like anti-doping commission. But anti-doping is something that is objective. You have either as a sports person doped or not. It's very easy to identify that. When you have something like a court, where an international court, presumably, where you have to decide on whether or not you need to ban individuals from using a particular platform, there's a lot of subjectivity involved. You have to involve a lot of procedures. The bureaucracy can indeed be very lengthy and onerous generally. But more importantly, the biggest example they probably have on their side is probably International Criminal Court, right? Which is incredibly dysfunctional, often underfunded, and are often accused of being like puppets of the particular countries that fund that particular organization, which means that international bodies themselves have their like a lot of problems of their own, which the government side cannot solve. But more importantly, we think in comparison to social media companies, there is one thing that is unique about this particular instance, which is speed. Social media companies, when they decide that they are indeed going to deplatform a particular individual, are able to act on it quite fast and then remove that individual from that platform, as opposed to having to file a case in a particular court, bringing that case to that court, and then hearing out individuals who are independent individuals there, presumably, and then going through that entire procedure, which means that there's a degree of speed that is involved. But more importantly, why would these individuals who are supposedly experts, not free from biases, not free from lived experiences that they have gone through, not free from ideological biases that they can have, was not explained in the government model, which is a huge issue. Then the question is, and the actual comparative is, why are social media companies better? I think Jess has already described a lot of reasons why. I'm just going to give you one crucial reason and then expand from it as to why social media platforms act the way that they do. Social media platforms make most of their money through interactions. What do I mean by this? This means that whether or not your content is left-wing or right-wing, your money is generated when people interact with your platform more. So whether it be hashtags trending on Twitter, whether it be more comments on Facebook, more messenger messages being sent on Facebook, more interactions means that you can sell more ads and so on and so forth. Like that's how the monetization of the entire social media platform works in this particular instance. What does this mean? This means that there is never a perverse incentive to ban anyone from that platform, regardless of their ideology. They can be right-wing, they can be conservative, they can be anti-immigration whatsoever. There is no perverse incentive because all politicians drive engagement within these platforms, which means that only when this interaction goes to the toxic level to which there is an actual harm to society, the threshold is that high, will social media platforms act. Without that, there is no incentive, no monetary incentive, no financial incentive for social media platforms to act in those cases. This is why the three most prominent examples of deplatforming in these platforms are Donald Trump, Alex Jones, Milo Yiannopoulos, a troll president, and 2 internet trolls. Literally, that is the list of most prominent individuals who have been deplatformed in this particular social media platform, which means that their accusation that this is going to be incredibly arbitrary, the social media platforms can willy-nilly just ban anyone. They have no incentive to do so. They don't want to do so because of the reputational risk that Jess already talked about. But more importantly, only when the toxicity level has reached that high will they act. Now, why is this then important? That when the toxicity level reaches that level, hits that level, that social media companies are able to act on it and act on it really, really fast. And this is particularly important in this case because these instances can have huge impacts, especially within the developing world, where a rumor can start a riot, and that riot essentially can turn into a lot of violence. And this is particularly important in this case, because when individuals, politicians, have a recurring theme of instigating violence, if social media platforms are not able to stop them from spewing that hatred, spewing that violence, then in a lot of cases, in countries like India, for example, Twitter is probably the fastest way you can reach, like, spread out your message to all of those individuals. In countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, Facebook is the fastest way through which you can reach out to lots of individuals. If you do not stop them and you're not able to deplatform them, and assuming the best case on government, you go to a particular international body and wait for them to do something about it, I don't think in those instances you will be able to stop the sort of instances where Donald Trump would have been able to probably instigate more violence, the same way he did in case of the Capitol riots in Washington. And we do not know if there would have been more harm if Donald Trump was able to keep tweeting the way in which he was tweeting right after the loss of election, where he did not accept the election results. That is something that is a huge question mark in this debate. I don't think government can get away by saying, oh, we're just going to put it into an independent body and they're going to do all the dirty work. Before I move on, any POI?
A lot of these political individuals often place themselves in a position where they build a huge following that allows them to be able to then push that very following to act at the point where they're removed rashly. This is something that we're trying to do away with at the point where we give it a process that can be tracked and therefore is something that can legitimize that type of action.
But why is it that, especially on the sorts of following that you're talking about, right? Why is it that these individuals who would potentially have a backlash, potentially be angered by the fact that they have been removed from their platform, be so rational as to expect that, oh, this person probably went through the proper procedure and therefore it is legitimate? Oftentimes, as Jess pointed out, it is true that the way in which conspiracy theories and the way in which these irrational individuals who are following these individuals work are that if they are in cahoots with an international organization, which is probably connected to the government in one way or the other, whether it be funding, whether it be like any form of connection that can be established between the government, then they can literally accuse them of, oh, the government or the international body is against us. That is why they have removed our favorite leader from that platform. And then that is an issue. How is this either in any way practically different from Twitter is bad, Twitter is on a rampage against the right wing? Even if it is that Twitter is bad and Twitter is against a rampage in the right wing, first of all, Twitter itself, in and of itself, does not evoke anti-establishment image the same way an independent body does, or the government, for example, does, which means that there are marginal benefits on our side in this particular instance. But more importantly, these individuals can still look at Twitter and still go to other right-wing individuals who still exist on Twitter because they're not as toxic and harmful as Milo Yiannopoulos, Donald Trump, or Alex Jones. At the end of the day, government needs to make a choice. Do they want to defend these individuals who actually cause real life social harm, or do they want to swiftly get rid of them before they cause more harm, especially in developing countries? Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to DLL, and thank you very much to all speakers for this round. Now what we're gonna do, we will deliberate with Shdipto, we will turn down the stream, and then we will come back to give some sort of overview, not necessarily the result, but like the what's happening in the debate, how we track this. So yeah, speakers, you are free to leave. And if we can take down stream for 10 minutes or come, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Thanks, Shdipto. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, guys.
Belgrade.